No royal commission.
A cannonball rips through the trees. Smoke fills the air. Men are screaming, guns are firing, and in the middle of all this chaos, a young man jolts awake inside a rattling carriage, completely disoriented. This is George Washington. Yes, that George Washington, the man who will one day become the first president of the United States. But right now, he's just a terrified soldier caught in the middle of hell on earth. He stumbles out of the carriage and into a camp under siege. Soldiers are firing blindly into the trees, medics are dragging the wounded across the mud, and explosions keep going off like the world itself is ending. George grabs the nearest weapon he can find, and, half-conscious, spots an enemy soldier lining up a shot. He doesn't hesitate. He fires first, and the man drops. But there's no time to process what just happened. His skull is pounding, his vision is blurry, and somehow, he still finds the strength to mount a horse and ride toward the sound of battle. When he reaches the top of the hill, he finally sees the full scale of the disaster unfolding below, an entire battlefield soaked in chaos. A fellow officer named Gage tells him it's over. The general has already called for retreat, and George's own men are trapped at the front. Any sane person would turn back. George does not. Before we find out whether he lives or dies, the movie yanks us backward in time, 12 years earlier, to show us exactly how a farm boy from Virginia ends up in the middle of this nightmare. And trust me, the journey there is just as wild as the battle you just watched. We rewind to a funeral. A teenage George Washington is burying his father, and it's here that he meets someone who will shape the rest of his life. His older half-brother, Lawrence, a former captain in the British Royal Navy. Lawrence hands George their late father's compass and tells him something huge. He's just been named commander of the Virginia militia, and now he needs to recruit men to serve under him. George isn't exactly thrilled about his family legacy. He's heard the whispers that Washington men have a habit of dying young, and he's starting to believe there's some kind of curse hanging over his bloodline. On top of that, his mother has just refused to let him return to school, forcing him to give up his education and work the family farm instead. When George pushes back, Lawrence gives him a blunt reality check. This isn't about what George wants. It's about duty. Furious, George storms off and tries to walk 2 miles to school anyway, but it doesn't work. He ends up right back at home, chopping wood in a rage. When his mother, Mary, tries to reason with him, he snaps at her, blaming her for killing his future. Mary doesn't back down. She reminds him that as the eldest son, he now has responsibilities. A farm to run, people depending on him, bills that need to be paid. Like it or not, this is his life now. Later that night, Lawrence finds George crying by the fireplace, and instead of scolding him, he does something smarter. He hands him a book on how to carry himself like a proper gentleman, along with a stack of other essential reading. From this point on, the brothers grow incredibly close. Lawrence becomes George's personal mentor, teaching him everything the schoolroom never could: surveying land, fencing, chess, horsemanship, and how to navigate the world of Virginia's elite. Fast forward to 1753. George has spent months writing letter after letter trying to earn a commission in the British Army. The answer finally comes back, and it's a hard no. He can't afford the entry fee for an officer's rank. He owns no land, and he has no formal schooling. The message is clear: stop wasting everyone's time and go join the militia instead. That same evening, George tries to crash a lavish party at the Belvoir estate, but of course, nobody without an invitation is getting through the front door. Undeterred, he sneaks in through the servants' entrance, and once inside, he runs straight into Sally, a young woman connected to the family who owns the estate. She's initially annoyed by his boldness, but there's something about George's charm that gets under her skin. She opens up, admitting that even she feels like an outsider in this world of wealth and status. When he asks her to dance, though, she turns him down flat. Undiscouraged, George works the room, impressing a British officer named Major Gage with his surprisingly sharp understanding of military strategy. But not everyone is charmed. A wealthy, arrogant man named William publicly humiliates George in front of the crowd, making it very clear that George doesn't belong here. Then George notices someone slipping upstairs and follows out of curiosity. That someone turns out to be Thomas, the actual owner of the estate. In the library, George wins him over completely by discussing literature with genuine passion, and Thomas is impressed enough to lend him a personal book. When George mentions he's willing to survey the dangerous, uncharted Ohio territory, Thomas likes him so much, he offers him the job on the spot. That night, at a local tavern, George reunites with an old friend, Christopher, also a surveyor, and convinces him to join the Ohio expedition. The two toast to the adventure ahead, completely unaware of what's actually waiting for them out there. As they travel deeper into Ohio, the land is breathtaking, and George can't resist writing to Sally about everything he's seeing. She genuinely enjoys the letters, but Christopher isn't convinced this romance has a future. Sally is far above George's social standing, and everyone knows it. 3 months in, the two men are freezing, exhausted, and their horses are practically dying beneath them. That's when they're suddenly surrounded by Mingo warriors led by a chief named Tennycarrison. He accuses them of scouting the land to steal it, but George manages to talk him down by showing him his actual survey work. Trust is built, and Tennycarrison reveals something explosive. The French have secretly built a fort nearby. Desperate to get home fast, George and Christopher decide to raft down the river, a decision that nearly kills them. As a waterfall looms ahead, they fight to paddle back to shore, but the current is too strong, and they're thrown into freezing water. Somehow, they claw their way onto a tiny island in the middle of the river, with no way across except swimming. A death sentence in this cold. Hours pass. They huddle together for warmth, praying for a miracle. And then, almost unbelievably, the river freezes solid enough for them to simply walk across the ice. Back home, George rushes to tell Lawrence about the French fort, but Lawrence can't stop coughing, and it's soon revealed he's dying of tuberculosis. With his older brother now too sick to travel, George realizes the responsibility of confronting the French is about to fall on him. He meets with Lieutenant Governor Robert, delivering the news of the fort. Robert wants Lawrence to lead a mission demanding the French withdraw. But since Lawrence physically can't go, George volunteers to take his place, even producing a letter of recommendation from his brother. Robert agrees, promoting George to major of the militia. But when George dares to ask if he'll be paid the same as official British officers, Robert is visibly offended by the question. George's response is bold. He'll serve for free, because he refuses to be paid less than men he intends to prove himself equal to. Before departing, George visits Sally one last time. She reads through his expedition notes and is genuinely moved by how poetic they are. She confesses her fear of making the wrong decisions in life, admits she has obligations she can't escape, and then kisses him anyway. George rides out with a ragtag militia, outlaws, debtors, enslaved men forced into service, and a handful of genuine patriots. When their scout's horse returns to camp without its rider, panic sets in. Moments later, Tanacharison and his men emerge from the trees, holding the missing scout, Tucker, captive. George manages to calm the situation, explaining they only want the French gone. Since Tanacharison's own father was killed by the French, he agrees to guide the militia straight to their fort. At the fort, French officer Joseph laughs off George's demand that they leave, though he still invites the militia to dinner out of mocking courtesy. Over the meal, Joseph bluntly points out the obvious. The British sent an inexperienced colonial to deliver this message, so that if it fails, they'll have someone convenient to blame. He swears the French will never abandon the fort, and George, refusing to back down, insists they'll be forced out one way or another. Joseph isn't intimidated in the slightest and throws them out. George rides ahead to report back to Robert, who immediately demands he write up everything for the council. No rest allowed. While George works through exhaustion, Lawrence reads over his notes and grows deeply alarmed. He calls it reckless escalation and questions why real, trained soldiers aren't handling this, instead of his inexperienced younger brother. He suspects, just like Joseph did, that George is simply a convenient scapegoat for the British. If the plan succeeds, they take the credit. If it fails, George takes the blame. The two brothers argue bitterly, and George storms out, devastated that Lawrence doesn't believe in him. The next day, George finally gets his dance with Sally at another party, only for William to interrupt and humiliate him again, this time by generously offering to lend him 2 enslaved men, as if doing him some enormous favor. Thomas diffuses the tension by congratulating George on his new rank, but then drops the real bombshell. Sally is engaged to William. George swallows his heartbreak, offers his congratulations, and walks away. Back at camp, orders arrive from the council: hold a defensive position, but kill any French soldier who provokes a fight. The militia is furious. This is basically a declaration of war, and they're nowhere near prepared for one. Several men want to walk away entirely, but George warns them that leaving now means being branded and punished as deserters. Tempers flare, and George has to forcefully remind 2 particularly aggressive soldiers that they swore an oath. This is their duty now, whether they like it or not. Then Tucker returns with urgent news. The French have set up a new camp just 5 miles away. Tanacharison believes they're scouting for a second fort location, so George leads a small reconnaissance party to investigate. As they close in on the French camp, a mysterious shot rings out from the shadows, killing a French officer instantly. Nobody knows who fired it. George tries to hold his men back, but the French open fire in response, and the militia has no choice but to fight back. Tanacharison's warriors charge in for brutal close combat, catching the French completely off guard. Sensing the advantage, George orders his own men forward too. The fighting is fast and merciless. Joseph takes a bullet to the leg. George tries to get his men to take prisoners instead of executing enemies outright. But in the chaos, his orders go ignored. When a French soldier aims to kill him, George is forced to shoot first just to survive. And moments later, another enemy soldier tackles him and nearly finishes the job, only for Christopher to intervene at the last second and save his life. Then comes the moment that changes everything. Tanacharison and his warriors capture the wounded Joseph and execute him brutally with repeated axe blows, right in front of everyone. The militia seizes the French camp and begins building their own makeshift fort on the spot. In his report, George admits he genuinely doesn't know who fired that first fatal shot, and he fears, correctly, that this skirmish could ignite a full-blown war. He pleads for reinforcements. Some of his men warn him that this location is a terrible choice. It'll flood and become a death trap. George, with no better alternative, presses on anyway. Soon, British reinforcements arrive, led by a captain named James, warning that Joseph's brother is marching in with an army seeking revenge for his death. Robert sends word promoting George to colonel, but James and his men flatly refuse to take orders from him. That night, the skies open up, and the desperate militia scrambles to dig a defensive trench in the mud. Tanacharison tries rallying other tribes to join the fight, but most refuse, and some even side with the French instead. Fed up, Tanacharison announces he's abandoning the alliance altogether. George accuses him of starting this entire war by killing Joseph, but Tanacharison doesn't care. Privately, he's hoping the British and French destroy each other so his people can eventually reclaim their land. Christopher warns George that the flooded trench is useless, and their food supplies are almost gone. He begs George to admit he chose the wrong location and relocate the camp before it's too late. George refuses to budge. The next morning, still fighting the flooding, James openly challenges George's leadership, calling him unfit to command, right before he's shot dead from behind. The French have surrounded the fort, hidden in the trees, and they're picking off soldiers one by one from every direction. There's nowhere safe to stand. George scrambles to organize a counterattack, but then the French bring out cannons, and the body count skyrockets. With no other option, George orders a full retreat into the fort, but the enemy warriors allied with the French chase them down, exploiting the flooded trench to slaughter fleeing men. Some soldiers get left outside when the gates are forced shut. To make matters even worse, the rain has soaked all their gunpowder, rendering it useless. The walls of the fort are too thin to stop enemy fire, and men keep dying inside, including, devastatingly, Christopher himself. George rushes to his dying best friend's side, and staring at the carnage surrounding him, he finally breaks. He orders the white flag raised. The French offer a deal. They'll take the militia's weapons, and George must formally accept responsibility for Joseph's death. With a British soldier vouching as collateral, George signs the surrender. As his surviving men retreat, George stays behind just long enough to bury Christopher and beg his forgiveness. Back home, Robert tears into him for triggering a war nobody wanted. Ashamed and broken, George resigns his commission entirely. Then comes the gut punch. George returns home to discover Lawrence has died while he was away. In a fit of raw grief, he takes an axe to a tree, howling in anguish. His mother Mary finally softens toward him, revealing that Lawrence wanted George to inherit his personal journals, and that none of what happened at the fort was truly his fault. She admits she was too hard on him growing up, which is exactly why he's now so hard on himself. She tells him that failure isn't the end, it's a teacher, and real wisdom comes from surviving it. When George quietly asks whether he should return to the fight, Mary tells him yes. That night, flipping through Lawrence's journal, George finds a private message left just for him. His brother had written that he was wrong, and George was right all along, that the world really could be changed. Now we're caught up to where the movie began. It's 1755, and George meets General Edward, alongside his old contact Gage. He offers to serve as Edward's personal aide, but Edward initially waves him off. With an army this powerful, the French should be a non-issue. George immediately proves his deep knowledge of the region, correcting some of Edward's faulty intel, and Gage backs him up. Edward relents and brings George along. Days later, their march stalls when a fallen tree blocks the road. While waiting, George spots old militia friends among the ranks and jumps right in to help clear the path, much to Gage's disapproval, who thinks it's inappropriate for a military officer to associate with such men. George doesn't care. He owes these men, and he tells them so. That night at camp, George is stunned to see enslaved men present, sent by Thomas's family as substitutes for military service. The soldiers are also less than thrilled to learn they've been hauling extra cargo this entire journey. Edward's personal piano. As the march continues, George works himself to exhaustion, hauling carriages through the mud by day and staying up late transcribing notes for Edward by night. Eventually his body gives out completely, and he collapses. A nurse diagnoses him with dysentery. But instead of letting him recover, Gage wakes him up mid-fever to reveal they're nearing the fort, and to walk him through the battle plan. George immediately senses trouble. He warns Gage to watch the tree line, but he's too weak to accompany them. Exactly as George predicted, the French ambush Edward's forces from the trees. The British fight back hard at first, but soon they're surrounded on all sides by allied native warriors, and men start dropping everywhere. Even soldiers hiding in the woods aren't safe. The British attempt to fall back toward the river, taking losses with every step. This is the moment we saw at the very start of the film. George waking up disoriented in the carriage. Now we understand exactly how he got there. Despite the pounding in his skull, he charges into the fight, kills an enemy soldier, and rides to the top of the hill, where Gage warns him it's a lost cause, and his old friends are trapped on the front line. George refuses to accept that. He rides straight into the heart of the battle, gunning down soldiers and dodging cannon fire as he goes, until he reaches his old militia hiding in the trees. But then his horse takes a hit, and George is thrown to the ground, knocked unconscious. In that same moment, General Edward is shot too. When George wakes up, he crawls to Edward's side, and learns the truth. Gage lied. There was never a retreat order. With his dying breath, Edward instructs George to rally the troops and organize a fallback, handing him his own horse, and, finally, his ceremonial sash. George mounts up and races through the woods, telling every soldier he finds the truth. There is no retreat. They need to form a defensive line and hold. His men take cover among the trees and begin returning fire, successfully slowing the French advance. Tucker reports that their old militia friends are still pinned down by the river with no ammunition left. George asks him to buy time while he rides to save them personally. When he arrives, he's already killing French soldiers with his sword. Under heavy fire, he tries hanging off the side of his horse for cover, but ends up thrown to the ground anyway. A soldier lunges at him, but George overpowers him and steals his weapon, cutting his way through the enemy until he finally reaches his stranded friends. They have no gunpowder, until, in a stroke of luck, one of the enslaved men who'd fled earlier returns with a full keg of it. Taking cover behind a hill, they open fire and cut down several French soldiers. When there's finally an opening, George tells the group to make a break for it while he does something insane. He steps directly into the open, making himself the target to draw fire away from them. He cuts down a handful of enemies before finding himself surrounded by native warriors. His weapon jams. They open fire point blank, and somehow, impossibly, only his hat gets hit. Not a single bullet touches him. He signals Tucker to bring in the rest of the army to create a distraction, giving his friends behind the hill the chance to escape, while George sprints back through a battlefield still exploding around him on every side. Back at camp, Gage can barely believe his eyes when George returns, alive, and with reinforcements in tow. When George confronts him about the retreat lie, Gage coldly justifies it. The battle was already lost, not worth dying for. He reminds George that his loyalty is to Britain, but this land, this fight, it's George's home, not Gage's. Later, Tannic Harrison introduces George to the very chief whose warriors fought alongside the French, the ones who shot at him point blank, and somehow missed. The chief tells George that his men never miss a shot, yet not one bullet touched him that day. According to his people's legend, there exists a guardian spirit that protects certain chosen individuals, and he believes George is one of them. He vows never to forget his name. The beginning of something bigger. When George finally returns to the city, Robert greets him as the hero of the hour, revealing something George never expected. His personal journals from the expedition have been published back in England. Suddenly, the entire British public knows exactly what's happening in the American colonies. Robert has even bigger news. He's forming Virginia's very first official regiment, 1,500 men strong, and he wants George to lead it as colonel once again. George agrees, but only on one condition: new uniforms. The final scene shows George standing before his troops, no longer dressed in British red, but in Virginia blue, a quiet, powerful symbol that something has fundamentally shifted. A colonial identity, separate from the crown, is starting to take shape. And we all know exactly where this story eventually leads. And that's the wild, brutal, and honestly kind of unbelievable journey of how George Washington became the man history remembers. Long before he was a president, before he was a general of a revolution, when he was just a stubborn farm boy who refused to quit, even when the entire world was on fire around him. If this breakdown kept you hooked from start to finish, do not scroll away without hitting that subscribe button. Seriously, it takes 2 seconds, and it's the only thing that tells me you actually want more videos like this one. Channels like mine only survive because people like you decide to stick around. So if you skip it, you're basically telling me to stop making these. Don't be that person. And before you go, drop a comment down below. Which moment shocked you the most? The frozen river? The axe execution? The bullets that somehow missed him? I read every single comment, so let me know, and I'll see you in the next one.